Dr. Gessler is a clinical associate professor in the first-year seminary and humanities program at the University of Houston, Clear Lake. She is the Mice Cook Memorial Professor in the Women's and Gender Studies from 2001 to 2022, doctorate in American Studies at the University of Texas in Austin in 2015. And her book, Cooperatives in New Orleans, Cooperatives in New Orleans, Collective Action in Urban Development, University Press of Mississippi 2020, is a cultural history of New Orleans cooperative development. She has also been published in Utopian Studies, American Studies, and Scandinavia, Radio Journal, and Journal of Southern History. Please welcome Dr. Gessler.
Thank you, and I'd like to thank the Network for Developing Conscious Communities for having me, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. So my talk today is based on the book that Arthur just introduced, Cooperatives in New Orleans, and I examine in that book the way women and laborers and immigrants and African Americans and other people of color created neighborhood cooperatives to advance grassroots social justice organizing in New Orleans from the 1890s really to the present. But really, cooperation has been at the heart of New Orleans from its very inception. For over 140 years, marginalized residents have blended neighborhood communal traditions and survival strategies with African and Caribbean and even European cooperative principles to really democratize the city's infrastructure and public health systems and commerce and banking and welfare programs. The cooperative story there in New Orleans is one of rupture and continuity. From cooperative grocery stores to community bike workshops and worker-owned restaurants, neighborhood cooperatives might sometimes be short-lived, but the concept of cooperation remains central to New Orleans' daily life. And as we know, cooperatives might pop up again and again, but they answer these practical needs of residents and provide innovative and economic and political solutions in times of crisis. So today, I'm going to address how the long civil rights movement has shaped intergenerational Black cooperative organizing in New Orleans and Louisiana more generally. I'll talk about, first, hospital administrator and Dillard University president Albert W. Dent, who created a cooperative health insurance plan for Black Louisianans in the Great Depression. I also talk about his tremendous influence on the next generation of Black cooperative organizers of the 1960s, focusing on Dillard University graduate Harold Batiste and his cooperative music studio, and Albert Dent's own son, Thomas Dent, who replicated his father's coalitional strategies in the Free Southern Theater Collective, also New Orleans. Both of these newer generation of cooperatives experimented with Black liberationist rhetoric, formal cooperative and more informal collective organizing, as well as African diasporic spiritual and aesthetic practices to create a network of Southern Black-owned cooperatives. And finally, I'll talk for a little bit about how post-Hurricane Katrina, racial justice cooperatives in the first 10 years after the storm continued this legacy of civil rights organizing to connect small producer and consumer co-ops into this robust regional economic network that informs city and state development. So just to give you some context, here's the map of New Orleans, if you haven't been. In my book, I talk about lots of different kinds of co-ops, but I just want to draw your attention to the area that I'll be talking about. In the middle, you'll see Central City, and then kind of to the top, you'll see Treme. Those are some of the African-American predominated neighborhoods that I'll be talking about in my presentation. Bookended by the deprivation of the Great Depression and colonized people's mounting calls for independence and community-led economic advancement after World War II, Albert W. Dent professionalized New Orleans cooperatives and integrated them within a regional and global social justice movement. He was born in 1904 in Atlanta to a day laborer and a house cleaner. And in an act that would shape his cooperative career, a prominent black insurance businessman became his mentor. And according to his son, Tom Dent, instilled in his father a, quote, starkly realistic sense of political and economic power. His racial justice strategies were based on the realization that blacks had little of either, end quote. After graduating from Morehouse College, his mentor, John Hope, its African-American president, who was a renowned civil rights activist and later became the head of the Southeastern Cooperative Educational Association, he helped Albert Dent, as a very young man, as 27 years old, get a job managing the Dillard University's, which was a black-serving institution, managing its finances, and serve as superintendent of the Flint Goodridge Hospital, which you can see here on the slide. And he was also groomed to assume the presidency as its first black president. So at 27 years old, Dent says yes to this job, and he moves his whole family to New Orleans in 1932. New Orleans in the Great Depression was, as is now, just riven by cultural and racial and class divides. African-American residents accounted for half of the city's unemployed, but only comprised a third of the city's population. Racialized poverty also led to disproportionate rates of tuberculosis and syphilis and high rates of infant and maternal mortality among black Louisianans. And at the same time, medical facilities languished in the segregated South. So out of Flint Goodridge staff of 35 licensed black doctors, only 10 had been able to complete a medical internship. And white-run hospitals in the city also refused to hire black doctors as part of their regular staff, which made it even harder to be treated by experienced black doctors. In their absence, inexpensive midwives that sometimes lacked knowledge of basic sanitation or sterilization performed 90% of black women's deliveries in rural Louisiana and 22% in New Orleans. And although there were New Deal welfare programs that tried to target this inequality, they were inefficient and pretty inadequate. So in the face of Jim Crow laws that narrowed black access to equitable education and jobs and healthcare and housing, New Orleanian cooperatives had been a great buffer that helped African American residents kind of negotiate this poverty and racism. In Treme, for example, and just to go back to the slide, it's at the top there, in Treme, health insurance cooperatives maintained the neighborhood's identity and autonomy and economic stability. They contracted with politically conscious Creole of colored doctors and funeral directors and pharmacists that were operating in the neighborhood in the black business district. As one resident recalls, because the North Claiborne Business District contained, quote, a vast amount of black cooperatives and businesses that catered to us and that we patronized, end quote, Treme's middle and working class residents could avoid the very discriminatory stores and services in other areas of the city. We knew how to survive, that resident says, by pooling community resources. Further, in addition to sustaining the cooperative economy, insurance directors and undertakers and surgeons, they were all key civil rights leaders in New Orleans. So cooperatives served a very important role in the Depression era New Orleans. So Dent, coming in, working with Flint Goodridge, he focused his cooperative mission on professionalizing this informal network of medical and financial health services. He assessed black Louisianans' precarious status, and he believed that black economic and physical health was intrinsic to political advancement. So his goals for Flint Goodridge Hospital were threefold. He wanted to have the hospital served as a postgraduate school for medicine for regional black doctors. He wanted the hospital to provide black Louisianans low-cost preventative and diagnostic health care. And he wanted to train impoverished New Orleanian young people for steady jobs within the medical profession. To do so, he reoriented the city's cooperative economy away from the more informal mutual aid networks of Treme toward Dillard University-sponsored cooperatives and outward across rural Louisiana and the South in a burgeoning network of Black middle-class fraternal organizations and churches and academics and businesses he believed would be most capable of solving racialized political and economic disparity. So what did he do? In 1932, he received a $4,500 Rosenwald Fund, which doesn't seem like very much at the now or at the time, but that allowed him to establish a penny-a-day cooperative insurance plan. And those competed with the more informal network of mutual aid associations. He modeled his insurance cooperative on Dallas and Atlanta life insurance companies, and his medical insurance cooperative recruited low-income New Orleanians as well as Black middle-class and professional clients who formed the backbone of the city's civil rights movement, from public school teachers and Pullman car porters and mail carriers and department store workers and nurses and church members, goes on and on. All of these patients only had to pay $7 to $9 as an annual fee, and they could be admitted to any New Orleans hospital, and they received 3 weeks of free hospital care a year. If you were really destitute, you only had to pay about $3 a year for full Flint Goodridge hospital services, and that included your board and your nursing care, any x-rays you had to have, or medicine or lab work. And he used all the cooperative profits to reopen Dillard University's nursing school, and he sent those nurses out throughout rural Louisiana to underserved parishes to help rural clients without access to Black doctors. And so by 1943, 11 years later, over 5,000 patients had used Dent's hospital insurance cooperative services. He wasn't finished then yet. Finally, he established resident-controlled insurance cooperatives in the public housing campuses in New Orleans as well as Atlanta. And he thought public housing construction would help low-income neighborhoods and improve their residents' safety and overall physical health, which was an attitude that was shared by a lot of other Black social agencies and civil rights organizations that wanted federal officials to staff public housing complexes with Black professionals and residents. His dedication to cooperatives only deepened after he became Dillard University's first African-American president in 1941. For example, in 1941, that same year that he became president, he joined 140 Black and white Southern students and social workers and federal employees who joined together in Baton Rouge, Louisiana for the Southeastern Cooperative Education Association's first integrated conference ever held in Louisiana. So students from the historically Black, I think there's some reverb. Students from the historically Black Southern University and what they described as a terrible work progress administration. They sang a beautiful solo, and they entertained the organization with some light musical entertainment. And after their introduction, the attendees listened to reports from all sorts of cooperatives from across the South before drafting action plans to assist labor and union and consumer cooperatives across the South. As the Southeastern Cooperative Educational Association observed at the time, quote, cooperation comes by tasting, then biting into, and then reaching for more, then digesting, and then by plowing and planting the neighborhood and community fields where study plus work bring results. They said that this integrated body of cooperatives showed great enthusiasm for, quote, cooperative responsibility in terms of security for oneself and one's brother. So Dent joined this group of Southern cooperatives. He talked with labor leaders and Highlander folk school supporters and leftist Catholic priests. And as he was talking to all these different kinds of people, he pledged to make sure that Dillard campus, Dillard University, was actively promoting purchasing cooperatives and consumer cooperatives and teaching cooperation in order to promote the establishment of all kinds of cooperatives, including those medical cooperatives and housing project cooperatives. His participation in this regional network of cooperatives mirrored his previous activism with other government and academic and professional coalitions to try to seize political equality and economic equality for African Americans and poor whites. At the same time, the stakes for formal cooperation were very different for Black civil rights leaders like Dent than for white Southern leaders who were attending the conference. Racial exclusion and everyday violence that his peers experienced encouraged African Americans to consider their collective future through cooperative economics. And so there was a groundswell of Black activists, from Booker T. Washington to Pan-Africanist and integrationist W.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey, who we'll be hearing about later in the conference. They all hailed cooperatives as an expedient means to construct a Black, quote, cooperative state that would eliminate global capitalism grounded in racial exploitation. So Dent joined many other activists striving to build a national system of Black-run cooperative enterprises that would lift this burden of economic exploitation. So eventually, Dent was actually elected to the Southeastern Cooperative Educationalist Association of Board of Directors, and so he became part of this web of Black cooperative experts in favor of professionalized, institutionalized cooperatives that would help vulnerable Black Southerners. And while cooperatives, he said, promoted commercial and financial development of Black communities, there were also mechanisms to win inclusion within American civil society and ultimately, he said, work out their own salvation as a united people. So his nursing services, his cooperative nursing services, and his public health cooperation, his insurance plan, and all these consumer cooperatives that he fostered throughout Dillard University really tried to challenge this economic marketplace that was weighted against Black citizens in the Depression and World War II. And he foreshadowed Black liberationists' 1960s and 1970s marriage of cooperative economics with political revolution. He and his cooperative colleagues at Dillard University believed that Black cooperatives, quote, offered a more fruitful way of living in this world until the requisite social changes materialized to renounce capitalism. So his cooperative vision influenced a whole generation of Dillard graduates who implemented a more radical approach to cooperative economics and racial justice to tackle this another battle facing Black New Orleanians in the 1950s and 1960s. And that was the backlash against the civil rights movement in the form of large-scale urban renewal projects. Taking advantage of impoverished inner-city residents' lack of political clout, transportation officials used public, road, and slum clearance initiatives to decimate Black communities. For example, the erection of I-10 throughout Tremaine's North Claiborne Avenue didn't have any input from the Black residents there and imperiled Black communal enterprise and self-help traditions. It took 10 years to build this highway, and during that time, it shuttered Black-owned businesses along this highway, and some were closed for good. So by the time the interstate was completed in 1968, the city of New Orleans had demolished 125 Black-owned buildings and displaced 170 residents and 50 businesses. So you can imagine the impact that that had on that neighborhood. So out of necessity, Black-owned cooperatives reemerged throughout New Orleans as a vital tool of economic survival in these Black neighborhoods like, to go back to the map, Treme and 7th Ward and Central City. Once again, Dillard University would help tie institutionalized civil rights organizing to an extensive network of community cooperatives. And so now I want to talk about another major figure in cooperative organizing in New Orleans, which is Harold Batiste Jr. He was a jazz innovator. He only died 7 years ago, actually, and he was a huge presence in the music scene in New Orleans. He grew up in Central City's segregated Magnolia housing project in the 1940s and 50s. He was steeped in the neighborhood's music culture. He used to sneak as an underage kid into Black entertainment venues like the Dewdrop Inn to hear groundbreaking rhythm and blues and rock and roll acts. And then as a professional musician, he was dismayed to discover that record companies paid session musicians in recording studios a flat session rate in lieu of royalties, regardless of the record's success. And further, the American Federation of Musicians was one of the most segregated unions in the country and did very little to remedy racialized economic disparity between and among performers. He converted to the Nation of Islam in the mid-1950s and then began searching for solutions to aid Black musical creativity in New Orleans. So he, in 1961, applied the Nation of Islam's theory of Black cooperative economics to his Treme-based music cooperatives, which were called All for One Records and At Last Publishing. He recalls, quote, "I had been listening to speeches from Elijah Muhammad, messages that had often spoke for the need for our people to create wealth through ownership. It seemed that every ethnic group was identified with a product or service that they owned and controlled, and it seemed that the product generally attributed to us in New Orleans was music, jazz, blues, R&B, and gospel." So All for One Records recorded New Orleans luminaries like Barbara George and Prince Lala, and even some early Dr. John records. And cooperative owners who bought into this studio, they waived their payment for sessions, but they became co-owners of the recordings and received a percentage of the company's earnings. At Last Publishing also supervised recording sessions, musical arrangements, and orchestrations. All the studio set up, they took care of all of that, and they acquired musical copyrights and even composed piano scores and arrangements. So for songwriters and musicians, the agency even recorded demos and circulated the material to other artists and publishers. So it was this hugely successful business enterprise. Ultimately, Harold Batiste wanted to create a Black conglomerate entertainment enterprise, he said. It was actually a victim of its own success. It folded in 1963 because all these major publishers and recording studios kept poaching musicians from this organization. So while it did end up folding in 1963, 2 years after it started, he was not alone in cooperating in New Orleans. In fact, writer and playwright Tom Dent, who was Albert Dent's son, he took up the cooperative mantle, incorporating Albert Dent's kind of down-to-earth cooperative vision and coalition building strategies and his desire to create a regional cooperative plan. And he incorporated those goals into the leftist Free Southern Theater Collective in New Orleans. From the mid-60s to its dissolution in 1982, the Free Southern Theater provided low-cost, politicized community theater and poetry workshops to New Orleans' poorest citizens. It also traveled throughout the South, performing plays featuring local student activists that documented the civil rights struggle for Black audiences. So all these figures, Albert Dent, Tom Dent, Harold Batiste, they were all rooted in this Southern cooperative movement that promoted Black political and economic empowerment within both rural and urban communities. So Tom Dent and his colleagues in the Free Southern Theater, they integrated militant communist organizational rhetoric. They were interested in non-hierarchical collective structures and an African diasporic ideology, and they all blended into this theater collective. I'm just going to talk about two moments from the Free Southern Theater's career to illustrate how its cooperative philosophy reshaped the city and regional economies to alleviate structural inequality there. First, I'll talk about its intervention in land use debates to redevelop Central City through Black-owned cultural institutions and businesses. And also, second, its work in the Episcopal Church's General Convention of Special Programs to create a network of Black cooperatives across the city and even the nation. So let's talk a little bit about the Free Southern Theater's philosophy and its aesthetic revolution. Founders Doris Derby, John O'Neill, and Gilbert Moses, they formed the Free Southern Theater in 1963 out of the Tougaloo Drama Workshop in Mississippi. They were Black Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, field directors working in Mississippi during 1964's Freedom Summer, and their collective was very influenced by Freedom Schools. The Freedom Schools were proposed by the later Free Southern Theater champion, and SNCC Field Secretary Charlie Cobb, as alternative educational institutions that fostered Black students' civic engagement and community activism. These volunteer-run schools rejected hierarchical instruction, instead programming student-centered learning based on discussion and critical thinking and leadership training. Classes were held in local community spaces such as churches and homes and parks, and the Free Southern Theater actually used a lot of these experiences in creating their own theater. The Free Southern Theater actors lived with local Black families and civil rights activists while touring Louisiana, Mississippi, and Georgia, and Alabama. They connected community theater with racial justice work. Its initial overall goal was to, quote, stimulate creative and reflective thought, end quote, in Mississippians and African Americans across the South by establishing a theater that was accessible and meaningful to them. Mirroring Albert Dent, the man at the beginning of the presentation, mirroring his dedication to establishing a cooperative network aiding Black self-reliance and professional advancement, when the Free Southern Theater relocated to New Orleans in 1964, it became a community-based incubator for local Black writers and creative writers and performers in New Orleans, but also across the South. They came at a very opportune time in New Orleans, because this was the same year, 1964, that the Lyndon B. Johnson administration passed the Economic Opportunity Act, which was designed to promote Black political leadership and, quote, eliminate the paradox of poverty in the midst of plenty by opening to everyone the opportunity to live in decency and dignity, end quote. So between 1964 and 1970, there was an agency called Total Community Action that administrated Office of Economic Opportunity Funds and integrated the city's employment service and tried to increase Black access to city government positions. Cooperatives were vital to this mission. Total Community Action set up an independent neighborhood councils and 6 impoverished student public housing projects in neighborhoods to help articulate resident needs and take concerted action to improve communities. And they did this by implementing job training and youth leadership and tutoring programs to establish all sorts of outpatient clinics and other educational programs. At the same time, there were Total Community Action funded cooperatives. There were neighborhood staffed credit unions and producer and consumer cooperatives and even food buying co-ops, and they all, quote, encouraged systematic savings among residents. By 1968, 4 years into this program, there were over 4,000 members in 77 Total Community Action affiliated community organizations, which represented about 1/10 of all low-income residents living in these target neighborhoods. And this movement was accelerated by collective newspapers, collectively run newspapers that helped cooperatives know about what was going on with each other and knit together this network of community councils and radical theatrical cooperatives and nonprofits, so they knew what was going on in each other's community. So Free Southern Theater was a beneficiary of federal anti-poverty funding, but they were very frustrated with Total Community Action's focus on securing Black political gains on an individual level. They believed that it contained direct action within existing political and bureaucratic channels. So for real political access, Tom Dent believed that Black residents needed, quote, dedicated people at a level where they answered primarily to the interests of the community, not the power structure, end quote. To that end, the Free Southern Theater aligned with a coalescing Black arts movement that infused Black creative arts with radical politics. And by 1968, in line with SNCC's Black liberation ethic, the Free Southern Theater ousted its remaining white members, and it began performing Black-authored plays such as Slave Ship by Black arts movement leaders, as well as performing their own Free Southern Theater authored works. And these new productions were innovative and exciting. They explored Black identity and strove to heighten audiences' self-awareness as politicized Black people. The sounds and images of the Free Southern Theater's music and theater and creative writing all recalled New Orleans mutual aid societies and culture and brass bands, all woven into working class Black social life. So it's very different from the kind of productions that they had been performing before. So for example, Tom Dent and others incorporated scenes from Mardi Gras and second line parades into their creative works. And these were the central community events for many Black neighborhoods. These social aid and pleasure clubs usually hold 2 parades a year, and they have funeral marches for their members. And these member dues go toward coordinating the second lines. If you've never been, the club hires a brass band, and they provide food, and for many hours, paraders go marching for miles through the neighborhoods, and the brass band will play mournful as well as celebratory music while the club members follow behind in these coordinated, elaborate suits. And the second line is last. These are the community members who dance together but have their own individual twists to their dances, revealing the activity and the parade's ability to embrace both collective and individual creative expression. And it really helps solidify community bonds. So Tom Dent and his colleagues were really inspired by these big parades, and they created specialized cultural and educational programs based on these that would help unite neighborhoods and educate and mobilize African Americans in these neighborhoods to achieve what they wanted, which was total independence and self-determination. So just as significant, the Free Southern Theater's permanent ensemble of about 8 to 16 actors, they wanted to develop a, quote, collective method of theater work that would demonstrate the liberatory potential of democratic decision-making to reshape New Orleans and society more generally. They didn't want to depend on a manager or a board of directors, so instead all members participated in the members' decision-making process, and they had either group consensus or they worked in committees to resolve issues. They had group writing sessions, and they distributed roles equitably. And they also selected actors for their touring ensemble based on those members' commitment to cooperative principles and Black liberation's revolutionary goals. So they were already comfortable integrating local aesthetic traditions into their works, and their commitment to New Orleans and its revitalization became even stronger when they moved into Central City, which is at the heart of New Orleans. It's another largely low-income Black neighborhood at the time, and it's a huge area. It stretches all the way, let me just bring you back to this map. It stretches all the way down to the Central Business District and to the Mississippi River, and it's also bordered by very wealthy white uptown communities, so it's just kind of hemmed in there. Over the course of the 1950s and 1960s, Central City's demographics has shifted significantly as white flight to the suburbs increasingly concentrated low-income Blacks within that neighborhood. In 1968, nearly 7,000 families lived in poverty, the largest number out of New Orleans' 6 most low-income neighborhoods. And further integration had ironically encouraged Black businesses to leave their central business district, so that by 1969, what had once been a bustling commercial thoroughfare was pretty much empty. So you can see the storefronts here of Central City, as well as some production for the Free Southern Theater on the right. So when Free Southern Theater relocated to Central City, it became part of a constellation of Black progressive stores and organizations on this street trying to redevelop the city, the Central City. Tom Dent writes that in 1970, quote, there was a bookstore down the street, a poetry journal, activists and political newspapers, even the beginning of a network of artists and activists. There's also the Nation of Islam, which was attractive to many ex-movement people because of its philosophy of economic self-determination, end quote. In short, Dent argues that this business district had developed a, quote, small Black cultural center which helped provide a space where radical activities and interactions could take place. And that happened within a Black world, he says, with very few white participants except for the most radical. So the Free Southern Theater also partnered not just with these businesses on this street, but also nonprofits like the Dashiki Theater to run community theater and creative writing programs. And that was also formed out of Dillard University by Dillard University graduates and to provide Black cultural and political role models for this neighborhood's residents. Dashiki recruited its members from Central City, and with the Free Southern Theater, they exchanged plays and actors back and forth, and they promoted each other's works. So the Free Southern Theater believed by helping like-minded organizations like Dashiki produce theatrical plays and other cultural events, they would encourage and support the revolutionary struggles of, as they said, the Black nation in America and oppressed people throughout the world. In addition to serving Black New Orleanians, the Free Southern Theater also had an abiding interest in the well-being of rural Southerners as well. And so think back to Albert Dent's coalitional work during the Great Depression with the Southeastern Cooperative Educational Association. The Free Southern Theater also collaborated with a range of cooperatives throughout the Black Belt South. And according to Greta DeJong, who's a historian of Louisiana, 1960s civil rights and anti-poverty activists believed that, quote, the cooperative model was a solution to the poverty and dependence that African Americans had suffered within the white-dominated economic system, end quote. So, for example, the Free Southern Theater worked closely with the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, which I'm sure many of you know about, throughout the late 1960s and 1970s. And the Federation helped impoverished, mostly Black, but other cooperatives as well, mostly Black farmers regain economic stability within a rapidly industrializing agricultural system. And they did so by forming a network of cooperatives and retraining centers around the Deep South. They were funded in part by the Federal Office of Economic Opportunity, and the Federation aligned with longtime cooperative organizers such as Louisiana priest Father Albert McKnight to open cooperative stores, agricultural cooperatives, and credit unions to economically empower rural Black Louisianans. So, for example, there was a very successful fruitcake distributor, bakery, that actually sold their goods throughout the North, too. So the Free Southern Theater was very interested in the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, and they subscribed to the Federation's newsletters. They attended their meetings, and they even corresponded with Father Albert McKnight about the future of Southern Black cooperatives. Yet the most significant action they did for the Federation and other smaller rural cooperatives' sustainability was the Free Southern Theater's role in actually funding their cooperative operations. By the early 1970s, federal officials had largely stopped anti-poverty funding to Black community development, and that had a huge impact on the future of Black organizing. And desperate to fill the funding gap, the Free Southern Theater and other Black cooperatives appealed to religious institutions to support their organizations. The General Convention of Special Programs was part of an initiative within the Episcopal Church to financially, quote, support the liberation struggles of oppressed people, end quote. It didn't evaluate the applicant's political radicalness, but rather the extent to which the organization would spur marginalized communities' development and political empowerment. When the Free Southern Theater received a grant from the General Convention, its director, John O'Neill, began working with the agency to fund other Black cooperatives. So as the General Convention advisor, John O'Neill visited Black-run cooperatives throughout the South, and he reviewed many, many, many different grant applications. He wanted to fund politically radical cooperatives in particular, but he recommended that the General Convention support any cooperative that initiated community development and inculcated political engagement. So, for example, here you have on the screen Grand Marie Vegetable Cooperative. He approved them for funding. They were a sweet potato marketing cooperative and producer cooperative, and they were affiliated with Father Albert McKnight and the Congress of Racial Equality. Since 1965, that farm cooperative had offered small Black farmers a steady source of income producing and marketing their sweet potatoes. Ultimately, John O'Neill hoped that a cooperative economy would, quote, create a political power vein, end quote, for rural Southerners. Once registered to vote and economically stable, Black residents could attend to the larger project of societal transformation. So they were incredibly involved and invested in developing cooperative networks throughout the South and even the country. And when they splintered in the 80s, cooperatives didn't go away. They offered a model that continued to exert a powerful influence on contemporary New Orleans cooperatives. And that legacy was only made more obvious after Hurricane Katrina and Rita just pummeled Louisiana in August and September 2005. Katrina's devastating winds and then the subsequent catastrophic levee failure, its flooding, all brutally exposed New Orleans' entrenched racial and class inequalities. As we know, 1,800 people perished, 80% of the city's buildings were inundated, and citizen displacement shrank the population almost by half. The federal government would invest $15 billion repairing 133 miles of Hurricane Katrina damaged levees and flood walls. In the first 6 months after the storm, thousands of volunteers streamed into the city with stores of food and supplies, and many were actually aiding newly formed cooperatives and collectives. One volunteer describes his days camping in former Black Panther and Common Ground Collective founder Malik Rahim's yard, schlepping mountains of food deliveries to the collective's distribution points in flood-damaged parts of the city. Organizers staffed distribution centers from sunrise to sunset, and legions of guerrilla gardeners from the collective and other grassroots groups also performed bioremediation on contaminated abandoned lots between buildings so residents could cultivate economically and environmentally sustainable backyard gardens. Urban agriculture helped underserved, flood-ravaged communities of color access fresh produce. It helped them spur community redevelopment and self-advocacy, improve resident health, and ensure some measure of food security. Over the next 10 years, cooperatives would help neighborhood rebuilding, often explicitly challenging city and federal efforts to privatize medical, housing, and educational systems. Critics charged that city rebuilding efforts concentrated primarily on improving the tourist and service industry by expanding shopping centers and highly trafficked tourist areas and redeveloping the Mississippi riverfront, but didn't spend much time rehousing vulnerable residents. Further, the city continued to drastically reduce its affordable housing stock, where performers and service workers, largely the lifeblood of the city, where they resided. So in the first 10 years after Katrina, gentrifying neighborhoods, rental prices in gentrifying neighborhoods jumped 25%. And because New Orleanians' average income was a third lower than the national average, more than half of the city's population couldn't afford the inflated housing rates. So I want to end my talk by talking about one post-Katrina cooperative in particular that aimed to integrate New Orleans into a statewide economic redevelopment campaign after Katrina. And they did so by using civil rights era Louisiana models, cooperative models, to help shape their institutionalized cooperative framework. And so I will talk about the director, Harvey Reid, although there are many people at play in the cooperative. Harvey Reid, came at age in the height of the civil rights movement. He was born in Tremé, and his experiences with 1950s and 1960s neighborhood mutualism highlighted to him the need of sustained community cooperation and self-reliance in the face of government apathy. In the mid-90s, he ran a successful gardening business. He was teaching horticulture, and he befriended Ben Burkett, who was a small farmer and Mississippi coordinator for the Federation of Southern Cooperatives. And Reid was very inspired by Burkett's work. He was working with a Black-owned cooperative supplying produce to Chicago, New Orleans, and the Greater South. And he was also working to recover and adapt indigenous, enslaved Africans, and Black freedmen's agricultural techniques that had transformed America since its inception. And this was particularly important work to share resources because, as I'm sure most of you know, until the late 90s, the USDA and other federal institutions had disproportionately denied loans to small black farmers, resulting in a dramatic decline in black-owned farmland from 15 million acres in the 20s to only 3 or 4 million acres today. So consequently, Reid became very interested in promoting small black producers in not just in New Orleans, but also across Louisiana. So he was trying to take this model and think what he could do in Louisiana. That work became even more important after Hurricane Katrina and Rita devastated Louisiana's small producers. So he joined briefly the Federation of Southern Cooperatives to help flood victims apply for federal relief programs, and he helped organize fishing and farming, marketing, and producer cooperatives, as well as credit unions, organized workshops to help rebuild marginalized Gulf Coast communities. Many people have condemned Governor Kathleen Blanco's Louisiana Recovery Authority for ineffectively distributing its $10 billion in federal recovery funding to Louisiana's devastated communities. They charge her with legitimizing the privatization of housing and workforce development and healthcare services. It also initially overlooked small commercial fishing outlets by directing recovery monies to large, well-organized advocacy groups for large fishing corporations and recreational boaters. Additionally, outreach centers didn't have a way to hold frequent or bilingual meetings in a public space that fishing communities could attend in order to help residents understand how they could get recovery funds or how they could even apply for an application for funding. So without adequate federal and state support, independent fishermen who had been devastated by these floods and hurricane would not be able to resume their livelihood. So in response, Harvey Reid had demanded, and he and his peers had demanded federal officials and state officials directly engage with underrepresented groups, quote, that had never been approached for policy input in the past, end quote, to democratically disperse recovery funds to rebuild houses and businesses and construct infrastructure for cooperative use. So that led him in December 2007, 2 years after the storm, to launch the Louisiana Association of Cooperatives in order to reconstruct rural communities and spark Black and interracial cooperative development across the state. Initially, the Louisiana Association of Cooperatives was very small. It was run out of a small office in Gretna, which is a suburb outside of New Orleans, with a staff of 9 people. And it educated the public about cooperatives. It organized co-ops. It collaborated with other cooperative organizations and government agencies, and it advocated for them at the local all the way up to the federal level. The Louisiana Association of Cooperatives won new cooperatives private and federal grants and helped expedite the funding process. So, quote, that a cooperative member does not have to put up their house or their farm to provide collateral for bank loans. People lose their land and homes because they don't have expert advice, end quote. Philosophically, the Louisiana Association of Cooperatives was inspired by historical and contemporary global cooperatives of color that were engaged in self-help, self-responsibility, democracy, equality, equity, and solidarity. And he pointed to the improvements that civil rights era Louisianan cooperatives, as well as current Spanish and Costa Rican and Pacific Islander cooperatives had made to improve their respective economies. Reid wanted to link Louisianans to a marginalized agricultural producers' worldwide struggle for land security and sovereignty. So he embraced the International Cooperative Alliance principles to promote and support autonomous association of persons united voluntarily to meet common cultural and social and economic needs in developing countries as well as here in the United States. And he made sure that his cooperative and affiliated cooperatives integrated the ICA's core values into all of their mission. He had training exercises and consciousness-raising exercises to really embed the ICA's ideas and principles into everything that that Louisiana cooperatives did. So the ICA tenets fostered in Louisiana cooperatives a sense of solidarity. As Reid says, wherever they go, they know they're part of the international cooperative movement. The Louisiana Association of Cooperatives post-Katrina statewide network is really indicative of a coalescing metropolitan regional equity movement that was taking shape in Louisiana 10 years after the storm. As environmental justice activist and urban historian Robert Bullard says, central city poverty and inequality across a region can stifle a whole region's development. So Reid was part of this conversation. He tried to expand this conversation by envisioning a kind of a hub-and-spoke regional food system to drive job development and economic growth. As food advocate James McWilliams theorizes, a hub-and-spoke model equitably can reorient food production by selecting central nodes, most conducive to environmental sensitive, high-yield agriculture, and then distributing low-cost food from these centers to more distant markets. And that's what they were trying to do. So to stimulate regional economies, the Louisiana Association of Cooperatives positioned itself as a repository for resources and knowledge that its affiliates across all parishes in Louisiana could rely upon. They were mostly thinking about rural cooperatives, but they also wanted to network with New Orleans to integrate consumers and producers. So they worked with New Orleans' farmers markets and food co-ops and community gardens to connect Louisiana's growers to the city's consumers. In New Orleans, they collaborated with the Crescent City Farmers Market and Solidarity Economy and cooperative development projects to implement job training programs for low-income New Orleanians. And they also trained both the Latino Farmers Cooperative and the New Orleans East-based Veggie Farmers Cooperative that were implemented after the Gulf Coast oil spill threw Vietnamese farmers and fishermen out of work. The association encouraged immigrant producers to, quote, integrate what you've been doing in your home country with the ICA's cooperative mandate, as well as how we do things in Louisiana. Reid's food hubs dovetailed with city-sanctioned food policies that were trying to create a recovery initiative to expand infrastructure for urban farms and community gardens, to advance urban farming policy, and to embed farmers and cooperatives within the city's master plan and comprehensive zonings. So consistent USDA support for disaster recovery and economic development projects also helped extend the Louisiana Association of Cooperatives' reach by providing funding to better, quote, connect our rural communities to each other, to our nation's metropolitan areas, and to the world. And the LAC was a recipient of many USDA loans. They had the Business and Industry Guaranteed Loan Program and the Rural Cooperative Development Grant Program. They got startup loans and funds for cooperative training. They were one of the first Louisiana organizations to receive funds through the Small and Socially Disadvantaged Producer Grant Programs, and so that gave them lots of job opportunities in rural Black communities by developing businesses and cooperatives. They also received a $200,000 grant, much more than the $4,000 grant that the Albert Dent received in the 1930s, to enable the organization to purchase furniture and equipment and supplies for affiliate cooperatives. And all of these awards provided funding for training and salaries for employees, and they were able to train over 200 cooperative members a month, host events throughout the parishes, and hold workshops for target communities. And they eventually helped organize all 64 state parishes. Finally, the Louisiana Associated Cooperative believed that contact with politically connected and state and national cooperatives and agencies would ensure communities of color had access to local and regional food hubs. Observing the racial and class divides between the predominantly white agricultural cooperative movement and the Louisiana Association of Cooperatives affiliates, Reid urged activists of color to join mainstream producer organizations lobbying for federal legal protections for cooperatives such as Louisiana Council for Farmers Cooperatives and the National Council of Farmers Cooperatives. In conclusion, analyzing the impact of civil rights activists to design analyzing the impact of civil rights organizing on post-Katrina cooperatives can provide a model for us to think about how to design place-based economic recovery. New Orleans cooperatives have offered a scalable model for social change, and veteran New Orleans cooperatives have formed the backbone of the city's modern cooperative movement, firmly linking current cooperatives to New Orleans' legacy of civil rights activism. Formed in the face of gaps in government resistance to helping those most in need, New Orleans cooperatives reflect how marginalized groups can create their own response to economic and political crisis by melding working-class communal tactics and strategies with national and international cooperative principles to best fit their local context. Thank you very much.
Well, that was a lot to digest. But I heard something in the span of time. In '82, I think it was, the debt sort of went through a decline. And it almost really mirrors the work of the Poor People's Development Foundation in the '80s. They went through a decline and wound up going out of existence. So I'm wondering what was happening in the '80s around Black cooperatives and the movement. What was happening?
Sure. At least in the case of the Free Southern Theater, nothing terrible happened. They were kind of growing up and starting families, and their interests kind of diverged, and so they kind of naturally dissolved. They didn't go anywhere. They continued to invest in cooperations and collective structures, just not as of that one organization. So they continued to foster cooperatives in New Orleans until late into the 2000s.
Okay, all right. Guys, got some time for some questions. Any questions, comments? Go ahead, back in the back.
With regard to your earlier in your presentation, when you talked about the workings of A.W. Dent, I believe it was, and then his brother there, was there any relationship between what they were doing and what was happening in other parts of the South? For example, Alpha Kappa Alpha had the Mississippi Health Project. Was there some other cooperative movement going on across states, not just in Louisiana? Is my first question, and I have one more thing.
Thank you for your great question. Yes, Albert Dent was very invested in researching cooperations across the South, so he would go visit different cooperatives, and the Southeastern Cooperative Educational Association was an effort to get all sorts of cooperatives to talk about their activities across the South. So yes, he was very aware of what was happening in the South, as well as internationally. He was really interested in Japanese consumer cooperatives as well.
Okay, and real fast, the second thing is that you also referenced that there was some collaboration that happened between W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington around this the same kind of effort of building co-ops. And so my question is, because what we've always been taught in history is that there was this friction between the two of them, and actually what the learned folk have come to understand is they were really on the same page, because even if you're talking about trade and technical education or going to a four-year college or university, it's all considered post-secondary education under the definition of the United States Department of Education. So all this time, they were really on the same page in terms of advancing post-secondary education amongst Black folks. So it's interesting how, it was reported so differently and a different narrative was created. But so the question is, was it this that brought them together to start working together, or was there something else that was also going on that we never found out about?
Oh, that's a really great question. I don't actually know if Du Bois and Booker T. Washington worked together. They were just both interested in cooperation.
I have a question. Was there any influence of George Washington Carver, Dr. George Washington Carver, in this whole? Did you see any documentation of him using his bulletin or using his work?
I haven't, but that's fascinating, and I would love to look deeper into that. So I will definitely go back through my archival notes and see. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Quick question, me?
Yeah.
Okay, what happened, what was the end result with the freedom schools? What happened with those schools? They're still going on? Oh, okay.
One last question? Any more questions? Go ahead. Can you stand up?
I just wanted to know kind of your interest in why you did your research on this topic in particular.
Sure. Thank you for your question. I was initially doing my doctoral research in University of Texas at Austin. That's where I got my degree. I blanked for a second. And I was doing oral histories. I was interviewing the local food movement there. I was interviewing gardeners, backyard gardeners, food trucks, and it was right after the Great Recession. So cooperatives kept coming up again and again as a way to redevelop neighborhoods that had been profoundly affected by the recession. And so initially I wanted to do this huge comparative project between Austin and New Orleans and Detroit, and then I realized I will never graduate. So, so I just narrowed it to my research to New Orleans.
Yeah, I just want to just, as a backdrop, I met Harvey Reid about 4 years ago on a visit to New Orleans, and I was down there exploring cooperatives, and I was introduced to Harvey. And so we built a really strong relationship over the last 4 years. He's been one of the instructors in our Black Co-op Academy. And so it was by way of Harvey that I got introduced to Dr. Gessler and her work. So, so just wanted to just add a little backdrop to my relationship and how I came to know Dr. Gessler. Is there any other questions? Go ahead, Kane.
Good afternoon. Excellent presentation. As we're reemerging with co-ops in certain areas of the country, how can technology play into some of this?
Oh, I think it has a huge role. Definitely on the end of promoting cooperatives, and I've seen an explosion, obviously, in cooperatives using social media to promote their work and to unify people that didn't even know of each other's existence. So, for example, when I was doing research way back in 2011, a lot of New Orleans cooperatives didn't know about each other and what they were doing. There was little coordination, and in that 10 years plus, there's been a real concerted effort to know what each other is doing through social media and communicative technology like that.
The cooperatives that Dillard University was involved in, do they still continue today, or have they faded out?
That's another really great question. They were pretty short-lived, but that's not to say that interest in cooperatives didn't continue to happen again and again. So those ones I particularly mentioned weren't around after, the 40s, but they inspired many, many, many different iterations. So that continued.
One of the things that we did hear was Dr. Dent's commitment to grow the cooperative movement and what he did in terms of bringing together cooperatives to address the inequities even during that time. And so I again am appealing to you to join this movement that we're creating. There are signups out there at the registration desk for the future, the Black Co-opinomics future. And so I would say to you, sign up. We'll talk more about tomorrow and Friday about our steps going forward in terms of developing this movement and continuing this movement around Black cooperatives. Was there someone, one final question?
I was just going to say, Dr. Gessler didn't say this though, but Austin has a lot of cooperatives, and UT Austin has done a lot of building of cooperatives. And I'm just saying that, that influences like what people study, what people think about. And so just having a robust, cooperative economy influences students and scholars to see this as a valuable model. So I just want to say that Texas doesn't have a lot of cooperatives, but Austin is a hub of cooperatives. And
All right. Well, one more question? Go ahead.
Community or food cooperatives. What about the impact that a specific agenda that was drawn from the federal government in regards to black farming and how that put that up? Because you always had cooperatives when we had a thick of black farmers. How has that impact and why isn't it never any conversation about the federal government's intentional movement to shut these profitable black farmers who were very successful, who had already created cooperatives within our own communities and beyond? So why isn't it never any talk or research when we talk about that, and particularly from our own government?
Well, I'll let Dr. Gessler answer it, but let me just chime in to say that the federal government has been a partner in racism and promoting institutional racism. And so as you well know, from enslavement to Jim Crow to separate but equal, the government has played a role in redlining and creating disparities that have impacted black folks. And so, yeah, we see some changes coming about, but they're slow. They're slow in their manifestation in terms of how you can bring equity back to the table. And that's why I'm a believer in reparations and using reparation models to address the inequities that we have suffered as a people. So that's my take on that. Go ahead, Dr. Gessler.
Yeah, definitely. I would say that rural black cooperatives in Louisiana are very aware of that, and they have been offering legal aid to farmers affected by those USDA policies and other federal policies that wiped out farming. So at least in Louisiana, yes, they're very concerned, very aware, and trying to promote ways to counter that legacy of destruction of black farming.
And tomorrow we do have Dr. Kamara Neal, who's administrator with the USDA, and it'd be a good time to ask her the question about government, the role of government today in the growth and development of black cooperatives, particularly in rural America. So, did you want to say something? Go ahead.
Yes, as a person who's not really new to the concept of cooperatives, not really new to it, I have an understanding of it. But I wonder, is there a place for cooperatives within areas that don't necessarily have a tangible product? For that, I mean, I know here food, medical insurance, things like that. But I'm talking about if a group of, say, writers wanted to start something like a newspaper.
Well, it was, no, but I'll tell you, it was told to me that any business can be a cooperatively owned business. Any idea can be a cooperative idea. So no matter what the basis is, it can become a cooperative, as long as two people form the idea. It makes it a cooperative. Yes, last question, go ahead.
My question is, how much did the narrative, or what role did the narrative play a part into the expansion of co-ops in New Orleans?
Which narrative?
Just like the narrative, like cooperatives when they were trying to expand
I would say that there are moments where the whole city is very aware of cooperatives as a way to expand economic development, and then they kind of forget about it at the city level. People on the street are always organizing cooperatives, but there are these moments where you see the city really engaging in cooperative conversation and passing policies to encourage, like after Hurricane Katrina, encouraging the development of cooperatives, and then they kind of forget about it. So it kind of just depends when in time you're talking, yeah. And that's been the struggle of this project, is that people keep forgetting about it and ignoring that it's intrinsic to New Orleans' development.
Well, let's give Dr. Gessler some love for her presentation. All right. We're running about 10 minutes behind, so you can disband here and head off to your next set of sessions. Just a reminder about tomorrow. We'll start off tomorrow, as we did today, with the meditation around 8:45. Breakfast will be served between 8 and 8:45 tomorrow. So make sure that you're on time, and we'll get started around 9 o'clock. We're going to meet not in this room here, but the room across the, I think across the hall. All right? Thank you.
I do. I do. I do. I get it all. I gave you the Keisha. Yeah, so
show right